The Debrief is a production of faculty at the National Security Affairs Department at the U.S. Naval War College. The views presented here are those of the speakers and do not represent the positions of the Department of Defense or any of its components.
Welcome, everyone, to this edition of the Debrief podcast, a production of the National Security Affairs Department of the U.S. Naval War College, where we explore contemporary national security issues and how they may apply to you. Very pleased to welcome today to our podcast Dr. Naunihal Singh of the National Security Affairs Department. And we are going to use our time together today to discuss the strategic importance of Africa to U.S. national security, trends on the continent that are things we should be paying attention to, and any guideposts you have for how things may evolve in that part of the world. As always, our comments today are our own personal expertise, and nothing that we say here represents any official position of the U.S. Naval War College or of the Department of Defense. With that, Naunihal, welcome to the Debrief.
Thank you.
So I thought maybe you could give our audience a sense of why Africa matters. Often when people think about the areas of the world that matter to the United States, we obviously have prioritized Europe for a century. People talk about East Asia, the Asia-Pacific. Where does Africa fit into the constellation of U.S. national security interests?
So, unfortunately, Africa is often overlooked by Washington, D.C. Africa ends up being an afterthought. The problem with this is that whether we're ready or not, Africa is the future. By 2050, 25% of the world's population will be African. Countries like Japan and South Korea will have pretty old populations. Europe will be aging and its population will be shrinking considerably. And with this will come a need to both America can no longer rely on European markets. They won't be as large. And Africa will have a number of things to offer that no other region in the world will have. It will have a large labor force. It will have large markets. And it'll have resources. So if you think about the green transition, a large number of those minerals are present in Africa. Minerals like cobalt or lithium, manganese, nickel, graphite, all of these are essential to electric vehicles, to green power generation. And so Africa has both the people and the resources that we're going to need for the future.
And as you're saying that, it reminds me that at one point in history, the Persian Gulf didn't matter to the United States, and then at one point it became really a central focus, in part because of resources, economic needs. And China is not simply letting African opportunities pass. They certainly see both the resource base, but also the manufacturing base of having a large population, a large workforce in play. Do you have a sense that the United States is pivoting fast enough to adapt to these African realities?
Sadly, Africa plays a fairly minor role in the way in which the world is seen from Washington, D.C. Africa is not thought of as very important strategically, and also it's not understood as very important economically. U.S. businesses do not invest a huge amount in Africa. They don't understand how to navigate that landscape. And as such, they tend to invest fairly little. If you compare this, for example, to China, China is Africa's largest two-way trading partner. The volume of trade between African countries and China is 4 times the volume between the U.S. and China. Similarly, China is the largest provider of foreign direct investment. It's roughly double the amount of investment in Africa as is coming from the United States. It's important to remember that we cannot ignore demographic changes. And the reason is this. If you look at why it was that Asia and particularly China have been so dynamic, it has a lot to do with the size of its labor force. And as as the Chinese labor force shrinks and gets older, China is going to face economic challenges now. Africa, as its labor force increases and as its market size increases, could play a similar role in the next 50 to 75 years as China and East Asia has played in the previous century. And so for these reasons, it's really important to try to grapple with the opportunities and the challenges that Africa provides.
So someone listening to that might say, that's a long-term perspective, but shouldn't we be focused on the immediate threats? And I don't really think Africa is a threat to the United States, or I don't see threats metastasizing from the African continent. So why should we put our focus on it? What would be your response to someone that says that Africa does not really pose immediate national security risks and threats to the United States?
I mean, they're right. But the thing about strategy is that strategy is not supposed to just be worrying about the alligator nearest to the canoe, but it's thinking about how the world is changing in the medium to long term. And if you sleep on the opportunities and challenges posed by Africa, it's a little bit like saying in 1980 that, oh, I'm not going to think very much about Asia. I'm just going to think about Europe. And if you do that, you lose out on significant strategic shifts as they're occurring.
I think that's an important point about the strategic shift that's underway. And to then ask you, given your study of African politics, African societies, how long will states there wait for the United States to get its act together before they have just simply said the future is China or the future is the BRICS, and the United States simply is too late coming to the game?
The good news is that African citizens are fairly pro-American. If you poll them, they have some of the highest warm feelings in public opinion towards America as anywhere in the world, more so than Europe, more so than lots of other places. So they are eager for America to step forward, to take a part in joint partnerships. But at the same time, they're not sitting around waiting. And so one of the reasons why the Chinese have been able to invest so much in Africa is because the Chinese have stepped forward and said, we're willing to engage in partnerships with African countries. And it's not just talk. So they make promises, but they also bring projects from the MOU phase to the shovel breaking ground phase very quickly in a matter of years, whereas the U.S. tends to have a much longer process. So the Chinese can finish a project sometimes while the U.S. is still in the planning phase. And as such, we miss out on important opportunities. And that's on the public sector side. The private sector has different challenges. There are risks involved in Africa, and the Chinese government has gone out of its way to support Chinese businesses that are operating in Africa. So they will provide them with guarantees, they'll provide them with support. This has been a constant, this is something the U.S. government is aware of. There was an initiative under the Trump administration. The current Biden strategy on Africa also talks about the importance of bringing the private sector. But we've insufficiently funded and staffed the parts of the government that might help to bridge private sector investment in African countries.
Well, that's interesting because it does suggest that it's not necessarily a lack of security imagination, but that it also is a matter of bureaucratic capacity and of the ability of the U.S. government to devote enough time and brain space to these issues. Do you see any indications that a shift is underway, a shift could be taking place? You said that the Trump and then Biden administrations were starting in this area. What can you see moving forward?
So the Trump administration placed an explicitly low value on Africa. The president famously made some remarks. He also allegedly, according to former Secretary Esper, was considering shutting down many embassies in Africa, pulling out a large number of American troops out of Africa, he really didn't understand why we had a governmental presence in Africa. The Biden administration is very different. And they have a plan, they have a strategy which talks about considerable engagement. The problem is that Africa's priority will still remain low, right? We are concerned with what's happening in Europe. We're concerned with what's happening in the Asia-Pacific. We're concerned with what's happening in the Middle East. We're concerned with protecting the homeland. And so Africa is really at the bottom of all of this. There are some things that they're doing which are quite significant. One of the areas in which China had really been doing much better than the U.S. was with high-level diplomatic engagements with African leaders. So Premier Xi, every time his new term would come, his very first trips would be to visit African leaders. And he's met most African leaders multiple times. And this is not the case at all for the U.S. American presidents either don't go to Africa, such as the previous president, or if they go towards the very end of their time in office, which was true for both President Obama and President Bush. Now, this is changing with the Biden administration. President Biden is planning to go to Africa along with the Secretary of Commerce at some point this year. But thus far, we've had visits from the Vice President, from the First Lady, from the Secretary of the Treasury, from the U.S. Representative to the United Nations, multiple trips, I believe, from Tony Blinken. And so the number of high-level contacts has been quite high. The other thing they've done is that they've changed the tone. These high-level American leaders are explicitly going to listen rather than to dictate. And this is one of the shifts in policy that really have been driven by the challenge posed by China. China likes to say that America says to the world that China likes to accuse Americans of paternalism. And China likes to say that their approach to African countries is one of partnership, one of mutual development. And so in response to this, this administration now is going forward and listening and trying to increase as many diplomatic contacts as they possibly can. So that's been an area of some success. But it is harder to increase the amount of private investment. There is a good deal of apprehension on the part of American businesses. European businesses understand the African continent much better, in part because many of them had business operations there during the colonial period. Africa is further away. American businesses don't have much understanding of Africa, and there are a good deal of stereotypes that come into play and discourage investment. And so you'll see, for example, that they expect a premium on return on African investments compared to other regions of the world, even when you control for all of the risks that are involved.
Yeah, and I think those are certain barriers that remain in place that will take time to change. But I think, Naunihal, what you've given us, and particularly for those watching working in the national security field that will be in careers not just for the next months, but years and perhaps even decades, an important marker to watch. And I think your comparison of where we were vis-a-vis Asia in 1980 versus where we were in 2000 or now in the 2020s, that over time these shifts do take place. They have to take place. The world is not static. And I think you've given the audience some food for thought about really thinking about reprioritizing where Africa fits in U.S. national security interests in the years and decades as we move forward. So thank you for your contribution, and thank you to our audience.